Welcome everyone. Welcome to ICCT's live briefing on Reigniting the Caliphate, ISIS Resurgence, Security Gaps, and the Rule of Law. I'm very pleased to be moderating this live briefing today. My name is Tanja Mera, and I'm a senior researcher at the International Center for Counter-Terrorism. So just a few words about ICCT for those of you who are not familiar with ICCT. We are a think tank and we are based in The Hague, in the Netherlands. And we conduct evidence-based research, we provide policy advice, and we conduct trainings and workshops, and also provide M&E services to different governments and institutions. So we work in the field of countering terrorism and violent extremism. And one should see this in the broader sense of the word. It's not only specifically in the narrow sense that we only deal with terrorism, but we also increasingly are also focusing on issues such as state threats, online radicalization, and misinformation. So ICCT is founded now 15 years ago, and we are internationally focused, and we are critical and committed in countering terrorism and violent extremism with full respect of human rights and the rule of law. I myself have been working now for over a decade at ICCT, and I lead the Rule of Law Responses program at ICCT. This program specifically looks at the different responses to terrorism, and we look, for example, at the use of administrative measures, but also how investigations and prosecutions take place against alleged terrorists. But we also focus on the use of designations. I'm very pleased to be hosting this webinar today on a topic that I and many of us have been working on for a long time. And we were just looking back at the date and realized that it has been, with one day exception, 9 months since the Assad regime had been toppled in Syria, and HTS is now the caretaker government. So a good moment, I would say, to reflect back, but also to look forward and to see how Jolani, the current prime minister, the caretaker government, is leading the country, but also what security gaps do we see in the country, and how does this look from a rule of law perspective, and what do we see in terms of justice, and then not only criminal justice, but broader, also transitional justice mechanisms. So before I introduce the speakers to you, just a few housekeeping rules. There will be a recording available of this live briefing at our YouTube channel, but only the live briefing itself. The Q&A will not be recorded. The live briefing will be available for those who have registered prior to the live briefing. Please feel free to add any questions you have during the live briefing. I will try to pose as many as I can during the Q&A. And in case some are not answered, we'll see if we can still address them later on. And finally, there will be a poll at the end of the live briefing, and we would very much appreciate if you could give us feedback about the topic and the live briefing itself. So now, having the formalities out of the way, I'm now very keen to introduce to you two speakers who have joined us today for this live briefing. First, we have Roger Lew Phillips with us. He is recently also has joined as an associate rule of law fellow at ICCT, and he is the legal director at the Syria Justice and Accountability Center, where he oversees teams conducting documentation and data analysis of evidence of atrocity crimes as well as terrorism. His team utilized both closed source and OSINT to investigate perpetrators and analyze systems of mistreatment. He has a long record working on the topic of core international crimes, and he has published regularly on issues involving prosecution of atrocity crimes and ISIS fighters, as well as transitional justice. He also teaches international criminal law at the Catholic University in Washington, D.C., and previously he served for 10 years as a UN legal officer at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, at the International Criminal Tribunal, and also at the International Tribunal for Rwanda, where he analyzed evidence and drafted judicial decisions and judgments. And we also have with us Dr. Aaron Zelen, and he's the Richard Burrow Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where he also directs the Islamic State Worldwide Activity Project. He's also a visiting research scholar in the Department of Politics at the Brandeis University and founder of the Jihadology. Aaron has published several books. One of them is Your Sons Are at Your Service, and this is about the Tunisian missionaries of jihad. He's also published a book, The Age of Political Jihadism, focusing on Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And soon coming out, I'm keen to hear when, is a book which he's working on now, is The Heartland of Believers. And this is about the history of the Syrian jihadi conflict. So I think we have two excellent speakers with us, with whom we can delve into the current situation in Syria, and indeed try to unravel some of the security issues we see, and discuss together whether there is indeed a chance of a ISIS resurgence and what other justice challenges are at the moment present. So maybe I'll start with you, Aaron, first. I mean, based on your research tracking the global ISIS activity, what factors within Syria's shifting security environment are most conducive to an ISIS resurgence?
I mean, there's a number of different factors. I think the biggest one will be whether or not the US decides to actually withdraw from Syria, since it is the most dominant actor in the fight against ISIS with the global coalition, as well as with the Syrian Democratic Forces. If the US leaves, there is no other country that really has the same capability to deal with this issue. Even if the US has trained the SDF, they do not have the same, intelligence capabilities. So a lot of it will depend on that reality. And then that could also further affect next door in Iraq too. Even though the Islamic State in Iraq is pretty much not too active these days. Besides the US factor, in terms of the local context, I think the fact that the new Syrian government does not control the entire country still seems between these territories with the Syrian Democratic Forces, with the Druze and Sweda, as well as in southern areas near the Israeli border, which the Israeli government's not allowing the Syrian government to operate in, provides conducive areas potentially for the Islamic State to exploit, especially since there isn't, as far as I'm aware, any active coordination between the Syrian government and the SDF or the Druze or the Israelis related to the Islamic State. However, since the fall of the regime, we have seen that CENTCOM in the US has started to develop a bilateral relationship with Damascus in terms of feeding intelligence related to ISIS, but also now there's been at least 3 joint operations that have been announced publicly. So that has filled some level of a gap in the areas that previously the Assad regime had been controlling. One factor worth thinking about as well, as we've seen in other contexts, in Iraq next door after the US invaded and the Saddam Hussein regime fell, you saw a number of former Baathists within his regime join up with prior iterations of ISIS because they lost, status in society. And this is one way for them, from their perspective, to redeem it, as well as get revenge. We also saw this in the aftermath of the Libyan revolution when Gaddafi was killed. Many people that had been a part of his regime also ended up joining up with ISIS and SIRT at the time. And so the question is whether former individuals that had been a part of the Assad regime, and I'm not talking about alloys because there's no way that's going to happen, but there were plenty of Sunnis that were still part of the Assad regime, and now many of them have lost, legitimacy, as well as likely access to opportunity as a consequence of the fall of the regime, and whether the Islamic State now will also try and recruit such individuals. There's also the issue that in the aftermath of the fall of the regime, the Islamic State was able to get some access to new weapons from caches of the Assad regime in the time period before the new government was able to consolidate the areas, since they had been coming just from a small area in northwest Syria into much of the rest of the country. And then all of the prisons were, emptied essentially in the areas that Assad regime controlled. Obviously, probably more than 95, if not 99% of these people were political prisoners. They had nothing to do with terrorism, jihadism, ISIS. But there were, amongst the prisoners, some people that were jihadists, and they had been out as well. And there have been reports that some of them have reestablished themselves in places like Dara in southern Syria, which gets to the issue of Israel not allowing the government to access those areas and therefore potentially providing space for them to take advantage. And so there's a number of different ways that this can happen. Thus far, it's been, like you said, 9 months plus now. We haven't seen any real evidence that they've had any resurgence. In fact, if you look at their operations, comparatively to previous years, it's lower. That being said, we have seen an uptick in the last month or two, but pretty much all of the uptick is in the areas where the SDF is in northeastern Syria and not where the new Syrian government is. And so it could be related more to local dynamics in northeast Syria, and the fact that many would prefer to integrate within the broader Syrian government instead of remaining under the rule of the SDF, especially in the Arab majority areas of Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, where ISIS is most active.
Before we'll zoom in a little bit more on the SDF and Northeast Syria later on, but I think it's interesting. I mean, you're mentioning indeed the US playing a leading role there, and you alluded to the weapons and recruitment. Do you see also any shift in funding for ISIS since HTS is in power?
I don't think that there's any real big differences from before. I mean, the biggest differences don't specifically have to do with the fall of the regime, but more just changes in technology and capabilities, where there's much greater usage of cryptocurrencies to move money across vast spaces beyond just Syria. And there's also signs that, unlike in the past, where money was moved from Iraq and Syria in the core to other quote unquote provinces of the Islamic State, whether Afghanistan, Somalia, other places in Africa, there's been some new evidence recently that suggests that the Islamic State's West Africa province, which is centered in Nigeria, but operates in some other countries as well, has sent money over to Iraq and Syria recently too. And so, obviously that doesn't have to specifically do with Syria, especially since it has more to do with technologies related to cryptocurrency. But it is makes it more difficult for the new government to deal with such issues, let alone, the United States and the global coalition.
Yeah, and I mean, for the caretaker government to succeed, as you mentioned, it's also important to be able to create stability in the country, but also to have support from the different minority groups. And you already mentioned the allies, but I mean, there have been plenty of reports of violence which has been committed against the Druids in particular, but I also understand that the Christians are also not feeling that protected. So, and how far do you think that this government is able to create this unity and stability? And then how far do you think ISIS is able to exploit the fact that the caretaker government is still struggling to create this unity?
I mean, I think this has been one of the goals of the Islamic State since the fall of the regime is to heighten sectarian tensions. We saw as early as Christmas, just a few weeks after the fall of the regime last year, that they attempted to bomb one of the famous churches in Malula, which is a historical Christian community going back 2,000 years, more or less. It was broken up with the assistance of U.S. intelligence, thankfully. But we've also seen them plot against the site of Zainab Shia Shrine twice,
Yeah.
also broken up. Unfortunately, we did see the successful attack on the church in Damascus in June. And so the Islamic State, like we've seen in other contexts, wants to rile up these sectarian dynamics. And the issue is that the country is coming out of 4 or 55 years of sectarian rule by the Assad regime. And so expecting every single issue related to sectarianism to be resolved very quickly is not realistic. Obviously, it has not helped that the government and or people that are allied to the government have been involved in violence against minorities, whether it was the Coastal Massacre in March, whether it was Sunni Bedouin involved alongside some government security people in the massacre against the Druze now about almost 2 months ago. So far, the Christians haven't really been affected by this, neither have Ismailis or Circassians or others for that matter. But there's obviously a worry by minorities about their place in society. I also think that the reality is that 70% or so of the country is Arab Sunni. So the type of government as well as the nature of society will be different ultimately when the majority is in charge now than what we saw over the last 55 years when there was a minority that was only about 10% running a totalitarian government, which of course minorities were able to take advantage of. But because of the nature of the new government, since it is not a liberal democracy, it's not a representative democracy, it is authoritarian, there's likely going to be different expectations also. Obviously, from a Western perspective, we want them to have full and equal rights. But we've also seen that, at least from the US government perspective, in the Trump administration in particular, that they've said they do not want to interfere politically in Syria's domestic politics, as sort of, I guess, lessons learned from past US failures in Iraq, Afghanistan, or wherever else. And so, navigating these dynamics is going to be very tense, which is one reason why more important than ever that they get the transitional justice issue correctly, because the fact that it's been such a slow process has led to a lot of vigilantism where individuals have taken it upon themselves to commit violence and revenge against former regime officials on a day-to-day basis over the last 9 months.
Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, this is a good segue to move to Roger, because indeed, you mentioned the many different kind of violence that has been committed to different minorities or those who may not suffer directly, but at least fear that their position might not be well represented in the current government. And I think here it is really important to see how the current caretaker government is taking accountability serious. And that can mean many different things. But I'm keen to hear, Roger, given the collapse of the Assad regime, what is the state of the criminal justice system in Syria? We all know that under the Assad regime, especially the security courts were seen as a tool of oppression and were highly corrupt. So, are the courts able to hold fair trials and provide justice for atrocities? Committed by all parties in the conflict, including members of the current caretaker government, but of course also ISIS and the former regime. So keen if you could shed some light, what is the current state of this criminal justice system in Syria?
Sure,
And
thanks,
then we
Tanya.
move on to transitional justice.
That sounds good. Well, I think the short answer is no. They're not currently in a place to be able to render meaningful, justice for all of the types of criminality that have occurred in Syria. I think they're in a poor state of affairs. There were the counterterrorism courts or security courts, as you called them, were of course, notorious for, mistreatment and lack of recognition of fair trial rights, just having summary trials. Um, Luckily, those have been abolished. So certain steps are being taken in order to remedy the excesses of the past. 83 of the counterterrorism judges have been arrested, and they're currently under investigation by investigating judges. And so this is a positive step. Other positive steps have been the constitutional declaration, which embedded within it certain fair trial rights, recognition of the international human rights treaties that Syria is a party to. But I think that a implementation of all of these guarantees is going to be the challenge. A number of individuals have been arrested since in the last 9 months for different types of crimes, and they're now starting to fill the detention facilities that were formerly used by Assad. So, they're refurbishing these facilities and filling them again. And I think there will be a tendency to repeat some of the mistreatment of detainees that has gone on in the past. It's just much easier to retread old ground. So I think there'll need to be transparency. There'll need to be monitoring in order to make sure that these things will move forward. I mean, Syria does have a strong legal framework. They have, a criminal code and a procedural criminal procedure law that are sound in many respects. There can be some amendments there, but and they're based on the French civil law, and so that they have been tried and true, though not respected in the past by the Assad government. So I think it'll be incumbent on the new government to train the personnel or to retrain them because they have been used to the poor practices of the past, the corrupt practices of the past, and to start to initiate fair criminal justice processes. I think one of the real concerns here is increased duration of pretrial detention. A lot of arrests are being made, but there are not adequate facilities to move forward with trials. Not enough lawyers, not enough opportunity to have defense lawyers for those that are being put on trial. And I think all of these things will need to be addressed before you can have a fair judicial process and criminal justice process in Syria. And so in the interim, we're having to look in other directions.
Yeah, before we discuss those, other directions, and there are a few possibilities. Uh, I have the feeling also that uh, if you have served for that long as a judge or prosecutor or defense counsel under the former regime, I mean, to create a new cadre of judicial staff might also take quite some time. Are there efforts being taken to create a new generation of prosecutors and judges? Like, is there a judicial training institute? Is that already active or not yet?
I'm not aware that it would be active. I think you're right at pointing to this being an essential step. You know how you have law students who could be the fresh crop of
Mm-hmm.
lawyers to come into the system. I agree. There's two difficult options. One, you retrain those of the old guard. At least they know the legal system
Yeah.
although the practice is not been ideal. Or you take, many years in order to develop a new cadre. I think, there is a lot of international expertise, and the Syrian diaspora should not be overlooked. We've had over 10 years of many Syrians have fled the country,
Yeah,
have
good point.
sought legal training and expertise elsewhere, in some circumstances have that legal qualification in other states. Some of them were trained as lawyers within Syria beforehand. And I think that provides a rich crop of potential members of the criminal justice system.
Yeah. Either way, it's not a quick fix before we have criminal justice system functioning again. But in the meantime, I do understand that the Jolani government has created 2 commissions on transitional justice and one on missing persons. Maybe it would be good if you could expand a little bit about it. What is it? What are the strengths and risks? And also, especially in the context where the leadership itself is internationally designated as a terrorist, how is it going to work in practice? Or is it just on paper?
Sure. I think the groundwork was laid for these 2 institutions in the constitutional declaration that was issued earlier this year. It discussed the transitional justice process and the need to identify missing persons, as most who are participating here would know that the Assad regime has a long history of disappearing tens of thousands, if not over 100,000 individuals during the last 10 years. And so in order to come to grips with the past, there needs to be a process in order to identify the fate of the missing and to address the victims and the victims' families there. So the Transitional Justice Commission has been slow to act. It was created by presidential decree and initially appointed a group of experts in order to set the way forward. There are certain inherent limitations to the Commission for Transitional Justice, including the fact that it is focusing only on or is mandated only to attend to Assad era crimes or Assad government crimes in particular. So that excludes all other armed groups, including ISIS, including HTS, including Turkish-backed militias or the SDF, or Israel or other foreign actors. So indeed, that is the vast majority of the criminality that occurred over the last 10 years, but it is not limited to all of those other crimes. And so that's a gaping hole in the mandate. The and indeed that there have been few steps taken by the Commission for Transitional Justice to date. The National Commission for the Missing has a slightly better track record. It has been reaching out to international experts and organizations. It has been conducting outreach with Syrians. I think it is promising that it will have an active role in identifying the fate of the missing. We have, millions of pages of documents from intelligence facilities which would help identify the fates of these people. And so as long as those archives are opened and there can be a thorough examination of those documents, I think the commission can make some positive steps.
Okay, a lot of moving pieces and working in the space of accountability. I think we can maybe later on also a little bit look more at the role of regional and international partners. But maybe I just wanted to go back to Aaron and discuss the issue of foreign terrorist fighters. And then I actually don't mean the ones which have left to join ISIS and some of whom are still in the camps, but I'm more interested to hear more on the foreign fighters that have joined HTS. And I understood that for a long time it was unclear what their fate is going to be. But I understand that it appears that the US has allowed them to be integrated into HTS, and some of them have been living there for many years and are actually more part of the Syrian society, have married and have children. And I understand that the estimate is up to 5,000 at large in Syria. And some of them are from North Macedonia, Central Asian countries. I understand some also have a relatively high position within the caretaker government, but in particular also many from Uyghurs from China. And I understand that one of the ISIS has been appealing to them to join them as ATS is considered to be too moderate. So I'm really keen to hear, what challenges do these foreigners pose, both within Syria, but also in their home countries. We understand that China is taking a bit of a careful role and not entirely happy with the fact that so many Uyghurs are now being integrated. But maybe you could sketch us the larger picture on the foreign fighters which are there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated issue, and I also think that the way of framing it in many ways, in many discussions, is too close to the way people discuss foreign fighters with the Islamic State. We know that foreign fighters in the Islamic State have been involved in massive crimes locally, but also in terms of external operations. Whereas in the case of foreign fighters with HTS, no doubt, I'm sure that they've been involved in war crimes as well locally, but there's very little evidence that they've been involved in anything outside of the Syrian conflict. Obviously, it's understandable that China's worried about Uyghurs, but China has also committed a genocide against Uyghurs, so their claims related to threats from them is also a bit cynical in many ways. Plus, many of these foreign fighters, when Jabhat al-Nusra broke with ISIS in 2013, and then later became Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in 2017 and broke from al-Qaeda, these foreign fighters went along with all these changes and ideological revisions and just focusing on Syria. And they've also built a life in many respects in Syria. However, at the same time, we've seen that some foreign fighters were involved in the massacre on the coast, as well as in Sweden. And therefore, many locals are worried about what role they'll have in society, especially those that might not be in the government itself and just being able to live there for free, especially since there have been proposals by the government to potentially give them citizenship. And then, there's also questions about, issues surrounding repatriation. Obviously, when we talk about ISIS, that has been a huge problem. And so it's a lot easier said than done. And then the question is whether these people actually would want to even return home. And I suspect most probably do not. They probably feel like they're living a better life in Syria. Many of them, if not most of them, still remain, for the most part, in northwest Syria, where HTS had been operating in Idlib prior to the fall of the regime. Of course, some of them have joined the security forces. Many of the Uyghurs are key security officials for Ahmed Ashara's personal security, the president of the country. And so I think it'll continue to be a debate that people have, but I don't think that it's one of the issues that is of most importance in many ways to Syria. In many ways, stability and getting the country back on an economic footing, dealing with transitional justice, rebuilding the country. I think from the perspective of the Syrian government, as well as most international countries, that's more of a priority than dealing with foreign fighters that so far have not been seen to be an actual threat outside of Syria, unlike ISIS. And so it's obviously a complicated issue, and I think people have legitimate worries, but we also need to base things on facts too, and not just potential things that could happen, which have yet to occur.
I hear what you're saying, but at the same time, I think there is a difference between whether or not they can pose a threat externally. And as you are indicating, there is very little evidence to show that they might, pose a threat externally. Maybe with the exception by some countries for obvious reasons, like China. But I do believe there have been indeed a number of reports where they're saying that the battle-hardened foreign fighters indeed have been engaged internally in some of the atrocities. And I mean, besides, providing, rebuilding the country and having the backing of and faith of the different communities in the country, but are they able also to control those foreign fighters when they do commit these crimes internally and hold them responsible? Because I think unity is also essential for succeeding, for HTS to succeed in the country. So do you see that there is enough control, and are they able to also hold them accountable when they do commit atrocities internally?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I don't think that we should be separating this between foreign fighters and Syrians. There are obviously way more Syrians in the security forces and way more Syrians who have been involved in the massacres that have occurred as well. And so I think that the rules should apply to everybody and that we shouldn't necessarily just focus only on foreign fighters, because then if we do, then we miss a whole category of people who have been involved in violations as well. And therefore, the big question about whether the government has command and control over different actors in the country in a general sense, I think is an important discussion. And it shouldn't just be focused on the foreigners, but the Syrians as well, since there are way more Syrians in the country, within the security forces, but also outside of the security forces. I mean, when the government had its fact-finding mission report related to the Coastal Massacre, they said that 200,000 people were involved. There were only 30,000 fighters in HTS before the fall of the regime, which illustrates another issue, which is that the country is awash with weapons and that there are many civilians also involved in these acts as well. And so it's a broader issue of the state's monopoly on violence, but also whether it can control people within its own forces. And so only focusing on foreign fighters, I think, misses the larger picture here, which is the fact that the government has still not shown that it can control all actors, as well as the fact that there's a huge problem because of the civil war, that many people have weapons that are not necessarily even in the security forces, just now, quote unquote, civilians. And so I think dealing with it on a holistic level related to all these issues is important. And just getting caught up in the foreign fighter issue, I think, misses this larger picture, in my opinion.
No, point taken. I mean, there you have definitely a point there. But it's like if they would have all been expelled from the country, you would have a slightly smaller problem. And obviously, you have to look at it holistically. But as we already, Roger alluded to, the current criminal justice system is not able to handle a lot. But maybe, Roger, maybe you want to just briefly reflect on the atrocities that have been committed after al-Julani has been in charge. How serious is he taking these atrocities? Because very often statements are being made that those who committed those crimes will be held accountable. How genuinely is he taking steps into that direction? And I would, for now, I mean, I agree, indeed, civilians also commit those crimes, but let's focus more on the ones which are committed by the army, whether they are Syrians or the foreigners, where he directly is supposed to have command and control over. What is your impression?
Yeah, I think, well, something is being done, and the question is it enough? And I think not. We look at the coastal violence and, 1,500 Alawis killed. In response to what looked like an uprising and an existential threat, at least on al-Shar's part, he perceived it as such. But that does not justify the killing of a massive number of civilians. So what has been done by the government in that respect? They appointed a commission to investigate. And that they came out with their report, and they said that there were around 300 suspects, and they had arrested 40 of these individuals. So I think it'll be key to focus in on these 40 individuals. What happens to them now? Are they properly put on trial? Are there going to be meaningful proceedings in that regard so that we get to the truth behind what happened? And or are they going to be released? And we also saw that some of the same actors who were committing violence against civilians in the coast were also active against the Druze in Sueda. And so obviously something was missed. The government did not take away those individuals who were committing the violence. I think the government um, needs to come to terms with, bringing to justice not just the low-level soldiers who were involved in the violence, but who may
Yeah.
have been commanding them as well. And I think we have, less insight into what has happened there than we do as to the individuals who are active. So I think additional investigations need to take place. And obviously, this this is evidence that people are thirsting for a level of justice. They're taking justice into their own hands. And so if the government is not moving forward more expeditiously with transitional justice efforts, then there will continue to be violence. Of course, there are spoilers, and including ISIS, who come in and try to augment the sectarian tensions. But the government will need to take more action and to show that it's not just playing a game of perception in order to please potential foreign benefactors, but
Yeah.
that it's actually taking these issues seriously and trying to bring about a peaceful transition.
No, I agree, and I think the point you are also raising, that you have to also go not only after the small fish. It's about also setting an example of holding those accountable who have been commanding and who have more responsibility. I mean, on accountability, I think the challenges are massive. I mean, not only the ongoing violence, such as the coastal violence, but indeed also the atrocities that have been committed by the former regime or by ISIS. So in that sense, I mean, it's daunting for any new government, especially if you are a rebel group, which has also been designated as a terrorist group, to take on this task. And the longer it takes to actually provide justice, also the more difficult it will be to gain support from the public. So you will have to move at different levels, at different speeds, and formal, informal, and the transitional justice. But I'm also thinking about, to what extent, can these ongoing prosecutions of not only core international crimes such as war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, but also terrorism in the context of the Syrian conflict in Europe, contribute to achieving accountability, and does that also help to deter, a potential resurgence of ISIS? Maybe you would like to expand on that a bit.
Sure, yeah, and many folks will be familiar with the concept of universal jurisdiction, which allows the prosecution of core international crimes in a jurisdiction where the crimes did not occur, so long as they are of sufficient gravity. This has allowed the prosecution of some Assad officials and other armed groups or members of armed groups within Germany, Netherlands, France, for example. There's also the active personality jurisdiction, which allows for the prosecution of foreign committed crimes if committed by a national of a state such as Germany. So a German national joins ISIS and commits terrorism or atrocity crimes in Syria, and then they are returned to Germany and they can be prosecuted on that basis. My organization has documented over 350 such cases where Syrian victims were impacted, and there's been a prosecution outside of the country. And these can help to bring a measure of justice to victims, so a palpable sense that there has been justice served. It can also serve as a foundation for other transitional justice measures, so that we understand the facts, we understand how the armed groups were operating or the intelligence branches were operating. And all of this can be conducive to a broader justice process. But the number of cases that can be prosecuted successfully is going to be limited. And as you were talking about, the sheer number of crimes committed over the last decade is, difficult to comprehend. And 300 or 500 or 2,000 cases will not bring about comprehensive justice. So it needs to be the foundation for something further. In the near term, the Transitional Justice Commission in Syria doesn't even have jurisdiction to consider ISIS crimes or crimes committed by other armed groups. And so what they seem to be saying is, well, go ahead and deal with those elsewhere. Another step that the new Syrian government could take, however, is to assist in these ongoing prosecutions and investigations in Europe. They could sign mutual legal assistance treaties, either bilaterally or multilaterally, and set up an office within its Ministry of Justice in order to respond to those requests, so that the cases that are moving forward immediately can do so successfully. And I think those are some of the steps that the government could take.
Yeah, maybe just to add to this, for those of you who are not familiar, at ICCT we have a database. It's called the Interlinkages Database. And there we track all cases from arrest to first instance to final verdict, including acquittals of persons who have been charged for terrorism and core international crimes committed in Syria and in Iraq. And we only focus there on those who are an alleged member of a designated terrorist group. And currently, I believe by heart, I think we have 97 cases, all in Europe, indeed, Germany leading, Sweden, Netherlands, but also recently a case in Portugal and in Kosovo. So anyone who's interested, have a look, but that's still the tip of the iceberg, indeed, as you say. I mean, that doesn't cover, the massive amount of crimes that have been committed in the countries themselves. And there are now some progress is being made in some of these cases that they also stream them live so that the victims can also follow the trial, so to bring more justice in a way, but it's still the tip of the iceberg. You also already mentioned it. I wanted to move to northeast Syria and wanted to discuss a little bit more what the fate is, of the foreigners which are being held in the camps and the prisons in northeast Syria. And especially now that SDF, as far as I understand, has reached an agreement with the caretaker government, and that they had certain conditions, 8 conditions, and also recognition of the Kurdish identity. But I understand there are still some barriers in the implementation of this agreement that would integrate the SDF in the government. So maybe first to you, Aaron, maybe you can enlighten us and explain a little bit more where we are, what is the relationship with SDF vis-a-vis the caretaker government, and what impact does it have for the security and in the camps that they were administering up till now?
It's not the best relationship. Obviously, they had an agreement on March 10th about the integration of not just the military SDF, but also the administrative entity that the Kurds essentially created the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, now I think like 10 years ago or something along those lines. And they've created a bunch of committees related to doing this. They also have tested sort of like scenarios related to this into Kurdish neighborhoods in Aleppo. But beyond that, not that much has actually happened. Many see the SDF as dragging their feet. Part of it also is that there's just a completely different worldview of those in charge of Damascus and those in charge of SDF and the Autonomous Administration. The government of Syria, is Islamist and wants to have a centralized rule. Whereas the Kurds, most of them in SDF and Autonomous Administration, want there to be a decentralized rule. They want there to be sort of a communitarian type of democracy that they've been running. And so they kind of just talk past each other in many regards. And therefore, I'm highly skeptical that there will be any integration anytime soon, especially in the aftermath of the massacres that we saw in March and in July, which has kind of dug the heels in of the SDF and the Autonomous Administration. As a consequence of this, though, this could lead to Turkey getting more overtly involved in Syria again, since they obviously do not want the SDF to control territory on their border, since they view them as part of the PKK. And although they've come up with some peace agreement and taking down of arms with the PKK, the SDF doesn't view themselves as a party to that because they don't view themselves as the PKK, even though most would argue that they're just the Syrian branch of it. And so that could create a lot of issues and potential destabilization in the future, which of course other actors like ISIS could potentially take advantage of. And so for now, in many ways, I think that a lot of what's going on, even though the SDF and Damascus continue to meet, is sort of a war of words and perceptions and framing of how things should go, but they're not actually really doing anything on the ground at this point, in my opinion, especially in the last couple of months.
And what does it mean in terms of, the control of the camps itself? Is there a change, a shift there? And I think also one of the questions we got is, do you believe that ISIS has the capability and intent then to attack our whole camp?
Well, I mean, in terms of the control, that has not changed. The SDF continues to control Al-Hol. The Syrian government does not control any territory in Al-Hasaka, where Al-Hol camp is. So, I mean, one of the consequences of the fall of the regime is that we've seen more Iraqis being repatriated at a rate that hadn't been seen previously. And now the population of Al-Hol, as of last week, was around 27,500 people, which is a lot smaller than it used to be. At its peak, it was around 72 to 74,000 people. Most of the remaining people are around 15,000 plus Syrians, but before the fall of the Assad regime, they were remaining Syrians that were from areas of the Assad regime, and therefore the US and partners did not want to release them into Assad territory because of likely these individuals either being killed, tortured, or sent to prison or whatever else. And therefore, it'll be interesting if there's a process to release the remaining Syrians into the other parts of the country. Now, we've already seen prior to the fall of the Assad regime that Syrians that have been in Al-Hol have been released to other areas where the SDF had been controlling, in parts of Aleppo, Raqqa, Hasaka, and Deir ez-Zor. But there's still a lot of questions on how much that will work out with the Syrian government. There's only around 5,800 Iraqis left. The Iraqi government says that they want to repatriate all of them by the end of next year, though they have increased the pace since the beginning of this year, so it's plausible that it might happen earlier. And then there's the issue of the third country nationals, which is still very high, 6,400. I think at its height it was around 9,000. And so the percentage of foreign third country nationals is in terms of repatriations is pretty poor compared to what we've seen with the Iraqis or the Syrians. And much of this has to do with the fact that most countries do not want to return their citizens in Europe and the Arab countries in particular. And so that'll be a continuing, issue and dilemma. In terms of ISIS's interest and intent, obviously they have an interest and intent in breaking out these people, but I think a larger priority is more the actual fighters that are in the prison system, not in the whole camp, which are mainly women and children. We saw back now, I think 3.5 years ago now, maybe, they tried to break people out of the Al Ghurain prison in northeast Syria. Some people got out, but most people were eventually captured, or SDF in the US stopped it. And so that's the larger threat, because I think that there's still like 9 or 10,000 ISIS prisoners, and pretty much none of them have been repatriated at all, because well, the argument about bringing women and children back is complicated. The issue of men is even worse. People do not want these people returned home, and so there's definitely a continued threat related to that, so long as they remain there. Whether the Islamic State can actually pull something off is another question. We've seen them unsuccessfully try and do other prison break attempts in the last year or two, also, that were not as successful as the attempt in early 2022, which I just mentioned. And so because of the relative weakness of ISIS now compared to the past, even a few years ago, questions remain. But we know the history of this group, and therefore counting them out completely is also a mistake too. But I think it's also important to contextualize that they are much weaker now than they were even in 2022.
Yeah. No, thanks, Aaron. And I think it's very good that you, also pointed out to, the different nationals that are in the camps. And I think the prosecution, if applicable, and the rehabilitation and the reintegration of these different nationals really is very different. And indeed, Iraq is by far leading compared to any other country. And I understand that 15,000 Iraqi citizens have already been repatriated, but that doesn't mean they immediately get repatriated back into their communities. They go to a camp in Iraq, and from there, another process will start before they go. Actually, ICCT has, together with IOM and UNOCT, been providing support and conducting workshops and papers on case management, but also on the accountability. So 2 weeks ago, we were also in Iraq, discussing with the judges there the challenges they face with people allegedly associated with ISIS. Okay, I think we are reaching the end of our live briefing. I would like to thank both of you very much for being so candid and open and sharing your work and your research and your insights on the current situation in Syria, and how the current caretaker government is doing, what challenges it is facing, what security gaps remain, but also the challenges when it comes to achieving accountability. I've heard a lot of challenges, but I've also heard a few opportunities here and there. And I think that is the ones we need to focus on. And it's quite clear it's not going to happen overnight, considering the complex history of Syria, on sectarianism. It is going to take a while, but there are some promising signs here and there. And I'm very grateful that you took the time to shed some light. I would also like to thank all the participants for joining. We will also send you an email where we will also highlight some of the work that our speakers have done on this topic. and feel free to reach out to ICCT anytime you want. So once again, thank you very much, Roger. Thank you very much, Aaron. It was a pleasure having you here, and I'm looking forward meeting you next time face to face.